Thank you very much for watching my film. This is the second part of a 5-part series where I'm tackling the whole Gran Guanche loop. I started in Lanzarote and I finish in La Palma, and this is the second island on that journey. If you haven't seen that Lanzarote film, I'll leave a card up there so you can watch it, or a link in the description, but it was an amazing trip. From there I got the ferry from Playa Blanca in Lanzarote to Corralejo, which is where I started my route here in Fuerteventura. I stayed at quite a cheap hotel. It was called the Corralejo Garden and Relax, but it was actually quite a cool place. It had bike storage around the side so I could lock my bike up. It was also like a locked gate, so it was very safe, and it was literally 2 or 3 minute cycle from the ferry port. So as I got in quite late that evening, the first night, I stayed there before I started the route. Now I'll be honest, I was quite nervous about this island out of the 5 because, well, for a number of reasons really, but the first one was I'd never been here before, so I didn't really know what to expect. But the second was, during my research and looking at the route, there were extensive periods of time where I was away from civilization, really out in the desert effectively, where there was nobody around, no access to water, there wasn't even phone signal for some of the sections, so I was a little bit nervous about that. It just made me make sure that I was prepared, so that every time I approached a town or a village where I could stock up, I made sure I had it on a list so that I didn't find myself running out of water. That was my main concern. Now I was pleasantly surprised actually. For the first 10 or 15 miles, it was actually quite straightforward. Because you follow the coastline, it's not that hilly or that mountainous around that section of the island. As you get more central and away from the coast, it does start to get quite tough. But a bit like Lanzarote, the outskirts are all quite flat, and then the centre tends to be really mountainous and volcanic. So it was very similar to that. On day 1, I did just shy of 50 miles, so it wasn't a short day. But the first 10 or 15 miles of that were relatively flat because I was following the coast, like I said. I stocked up at a little town called El Cotillo. That's where I stopped at a supermarket, stocked up on food and water again before heading on again. From that point onwards, it was a very isolated part of the island. I ended up just going round the coastline on gravelly tracks before coming across a barranco, and there's loads of barrancos across the entire route of the Gran Guanche. Although there's no fresh water on the island, these barrancos were formed through volcanic activity, lava, many millions of years ago. So as a result, they're sort of carved out through the island. You find that moisture tends to sink down there because of the fact they're lower than everywhere else, and they're sheltered from the wind, so you do get some plant life there, which is really nice to see. When I started in Lanzarote, it's 99% desert, and each island I went to subsequently got a little bit greener, and you started to see a little bit of greenery at this point. It was really nice just to get out of the wind into an area where there's actually some trees and plants and some wildlife. It was really nice, but again, it was very isolated. I spent most of my day on tracks like this. There were times where I didn't see anybody for hours on end, so it was very remote, and I was glad that I took loads of water with me. I mentioned in the last video, I took a 2-litre bladder in the frame bag and a 1.5 litres in my sort of rear pack, as well as a bottle as well. And I was glad I had all of that fluid with me. I did my final stock up at a tiny village called Llanos de la Concepcion. There was a tiny little market that sold just enough food that I could stock up and get some more water for that evening, because my plan was to camp down one of the Barrancos along the west coast. That section along the Barrancos was really challenging. I was actually quite surprised at how hard it was. The Barrancos are quite steep, and there's also quite deep ravines where the riverbeds were, and as a result the road kind of follows that undulation. It's not sort of cutting through or going round in any way, it literally follows the lay of the land, which makes the cycling very challenging. I also had absolutely no phone signal there at all, so I couldn't even make a phone call, let alone send a text. As a result, I was a little bit worried at this point. It starts to get to me when I think I haven't got any means to contact anyone, there's no civilization nearby and no running water. It's just those sort of fears, you know, needing that basic stuff that I didn't necessarily have. However, everything went absolutely fine. I found an absolutely ideal camp spot down one of the Barrancos that was kind of hidden. There was a few sort of layers, a few drops that I went down, and it was like a sandy surface underneath, so it was really comfortable to lay on. The tent pegs went in absolutely fine, and because of the way that the Barranco was shaped, it was very sheltered. I was out of the wind, and the wind can be really strong on this island. So I was really happy with my camp spot. I was very well hidden, because wild camping isn't legal like it isn't here in England, so I wanted to make sure that no one would see me, and I didn't see a single person or hear anybody all night. So I had a great night's sleep, so I was feeling pretty refreshed to tackle day 2 the following morning. The next morning I packed up my stuff and carried on the Barrancos, and they were really tough. In fact, day 2 the following morning was even harder than the day prior. There were some incredibly steep gravel tracks that I had to get off and walk. I just couldn't get the traction on that bike because it was so heavy. So I had to get off and walk for several sections. It took me 2 hours to do less than 3 miles, which shows you how slow I was going. Although I was doing filming, so that is going to slow me down a little bit, it was mostly down to the terrain. It was really hot, no shelter from the wind, and super steep and slippy with the amount of gravel that was there. However, after hours and hours of trekking that bike, I got right to the top. I could see a few miles into the distance, I could see a village, and that sort of filled me with a bit of hope. And it was downhill on these steep gravelly tracks for most of the way from that point. And by that point, when I actually arrived, I'd maybe done less than 10 miles, and it felt like I'd been cycling all day already. So although I was nervous about Fuerteventura, I knew it might be hard, those fears were justified. It was an incredibly challenging section. So I rejoined the road finally at a little town called Ayu. It felt like I hadn't been on tarmac for ages, and it was so nice to get back on that just to make some decent progress. Although I was on tarmac though, the wind was quite strong, so I wasn't going super quickly, but it definitely was a damn sight better than walking up those super steep gravel tracks. My finishing point of the day was a town called Morro Jable, which is one of the most southerly towns on the island, and that's where I was going to be catching the ferry to Gran Canaria. I was in quite a good position this time because the ferry wasn't until the following morning. It was very early in the morning, but it meant that I didn't have to rush like I did in Lanzarote. I had to make some serious changes to catch the ferry to get to Fuerteventura. Although I wasn't in a major rush to get to Morro Jable, I was starting to feel quite fatigued at this point. There was a really strong headwind in the direction that I was going to Morro Jable for most of the day, and it was getting worse at this point. My knee was starting to hurt as well. I do occasionally get a little bit of knee pain in my left knee if I've been pushing it too hard, and that's what was happening. So where I was very near a town called Costa Calma, and I thought I'd have a look to see if there was a chance of catching a bus the last 8 or 9 miles to avoid me having to carry on that slog in the headwind. I waited for about 20 minutes, and fantastically there was a bus that allowed me to take my bike on. It doesn't cost any extra, and this is something I was really impressed with the Canary Islands. Here in the UK, you cannot take your bike on a bus. If you can, it's usually on a specialist service and you have to book. It's very uncommon. You cannot do it 99% of the time. So for me, just being able to chuck my bike on a bus at no extra cost with no fuss at all is an amazing thing. So I was really impressed with that, and it's something I actually used again in a subsequent trip on one of the other islands, but you'll have to stay tuned for that. The next island on this trip is Gran Canaria, and I can tell you that that section of the route was very eventful and you don't want to miss that one. So make sure you subscribe if you're not already. That will be coming out next month. Give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment if you've got any questions, and I'll see you in the next video.